I'm Sarah Mitchell, 28, and until 3 weeks ago, my parents considered me the family's biggest disappointment after serving to tours in Afghanistan as a combat medic. I came home with PTSD and struggled to find my place in civilian life. My mother would whisper to neighbors, "The military ruined her completely," while my father refused to even acknowledge my service. They favored my younger brother Jake, the golden child who became a successful lawyer, always introducing him as our pride and joy while I remained invisible at family gatherings. But everything changed when I received an unexpected phone call from the White House. The President of the United States wanted to personally thank me for my heroic actions that saved 12 soldiers during an ambush in Kandahar, actions my family never knew about because they never asked. Tomorrow, I'm flying to Washington, D.C. to receive the Medal of Honor, and my parents are about to discover who their daughter really is. Like and subscribe if you've ever been underestimated by your own family. Growing up in suburban Denver, I always felt like I was living in Jake's shadow. Even as children, the difference in how our parents treated us was painfully obvious. While Jake's finger paintings decorated the refrigerator for months, my artwork disappeared within days. When he struggled with math, Dad spent hours helping him at the kitchen table. When I needed help with science, I was told to figure it out yourself. The photograph from my high school graduation tells the whole story. There's Jake, beaming in his cap and gown, surrounded by our parents, grandparents, aunts, and uncles. Everyone's eyes are on him, faces glowing with pride. I'm standing awkwardly to the side, barely in frame, like an afterthought. That's exactly how I felt that day and most days growing up. Jake graduated summa cum laude, class president, destined for Harvard Law School. I graduated with decent grades, but no fanfare, no college fund waiting for me, no celebratory dinner. When I announced I'd enlisted in the Army, the silence at the dinner table was deafening. The military, Mom's voice dripped with disappointment. "Sarah, that's for people who have no other options." Dad folded his newspaper with deliberate precision. "We raised you better than that. This is just another one of your impulsive decisions." But it wasn't impulsive. I'd thought about it for months. I wanted to serve my country, to do something meaningful with my life. More than that, I wanted to prove I could succeed at something, that I was worth more than they believed. "I want to be a combat medic," I explained. "I want to save lives." Jake looked up from his pre-law textbooks. "Sarah, be realistic. You faint at the sight of blood." That wasn't true anymore. I'd conquered that fear during my volunteer work at the local hospital, but they wouldn't know that because they never asked about my life. The morning I left for basic training, Jake was already at his summer internship at a prestigious law firm. Dad had left early for work without saying goodbye. Only Mom drove me to the recruitment center, and even then, she spent the entire drive trying to convince me to change my mind. "It's not too late," she said as we pulled into the parking lot. "You could still apply to community college, start small." I hugged her goodbye, hoping for some warmth, some encouragement, anything that resembled parental support. Instead, she patted my back awkwardly and said, "I hope you know what you're doing." As I walked into that building, carrying my single duffel bag, I made myself a promise. I would prove them wrong. I would become someone they could be proud of, even if they never admitted it. But what I didn't realize then was how much their lack of faith in me would hurt when I needed their support the most. I thought earning their respect would be the hardest part. I was wrong. The hardest part would be coming home broken and having them see it as confirmation that they'd been right about me all along. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd spent years saving other people's lives while my own family couldn't be bothered to save our relationship. Basic training transformed me in ways I never expected. The drill sergeant stripped away every insecurity, every doubt my family had planted in my mind, and built me back up into a soldier. For the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged somewhere. My dog tags became my most prized possession, not just because they identified me as a member of the United States Army, but because they represented everything I'd overcome to earn them. Mitchell, Sarah J. stamped in cold metal, followed by my service number and blood type. Those tags meant more to me than any diploma or award ever could. Combat medic training pushed me to my limits. We learned to perform life-saving procedures under the most extreme conditions imaginable. I discovered I had steady hands under pressure, a calm voice during chaos, and an instinct for triage that impressed even the most seasoned instructors. "Mitchell, you've got what it takes," Sergeant Rodriguez told me after a particularly challenging simulation. Some people freeze when lives are on the line, you get focused. My first deployment to Afghanistan came 8 months after I completed training as our transport plane descended toward Bagram airfield. My stomach churned with a mixture of excitement and terror. The landscape below looked like another planet, brown, mountainous. Unforgiving, the heat hit me like a physical wall. When we stepped off the plane, even at dawn, the temperature was already climbing toward what would be another scorching day. The base was a sprawling complex of prefabricated buildings, concrete barriers, and razor wire, all surrounded by mountains that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. I was assigned to Forward Operating Base Chapman, a smaller outpost about 50 miles from Bagram. The medics I served with became my closest friends, people who understood the weight of responsibility we carried. There was Doc Martinez, a soft-spoken man from Texas who'd saved more lives than anyone could count, Corporal Johnson, barely 21 but already a veteran of 2 deployments, and Staff Sergeant Williams, who took me under her wing and taught me that being a medic meant being part psychologist, part priest, and part miracle worker. Your job isn't just to treat wounds, she explained during one of our quiet moments between missions. Your job is to give hope when there isn't any. Sometimes that's more powerful than any medicine. My first real test came 3 weeks into deployment, and I'd exploded near a convoy, and we were called in to provide medical support. I'll never forget the sound of that helicopter's rotors as we approached the scene, or the smell of smoke and burning metal that filled the air. 2 soldiers were critically injured. One had severe burns across his torso. The other was bleeding from shrapnel wounds to his legs and abdomen. As I worked on them, my training took over. My hands moved with precision. My voice stayed calm, and I focused entirely on keeping them alive long enough to get them to proper medical facilities. Both soldiers survived. When I called home that night to share what I thought was incredible news that I'd helped save 2 lives, my mother's response was lukewarm at best. "That's nice, dear," she said, her voice distracted. "Jake just got promoted to junior partner track at his firm. Can you believe it? He's only 26. That conversation lasted 3 more minutes, with 2.5 of those minutes devoted to Jake's achievements. When I hung up, Doc Martinez found me sitting outside our quarters, staring up at the stars. "Family troubles?" he asked, settling down beside me. "They don't get it," I said. "They don't understand what we do here. Most people don't," he replied. "That's why we have each other. The people who matter understand. The people who love you will try to understand, even if they don't at first." But as the months passed, it became clear that my family fell into neither category. The morning of March 15, 2018, started like any other. I was finishing my second cup of coffee when the alarm sounded. Incoming wounded from a patrol that had been ambushed in the Kandahar province. What I didn't know was that this day would define the rest of my life. The helicopter arrived with 3 wounded soldiers, but as it was landing, we received word that the situation at the ambush site had deteriorated. A full squad, 12 men, was pinned down by Taliban fighters in a narrow valley with no easy extraction route. 2 medics had already been wounded trying to reach them. "We need a volunteer," Captain Morrison announced. "This is going to be dangerous. The LZ is hot, and we're not sure we can guarantee extraction." I didn't hesitate. "I'll go, sir." Staff Sergeant Williams grabbed my arm. "Sarah, this isn't a routine mission. They're taking heavy fire." But something inside me knew I had to be on that helicopter. My medical kit felt heavier than usual as I strapped it on, but my hands were steady. The blood-stained canvas bag contained everything I might need to keep someone alive: tourniquets, hemostatic agents, morphine for fluids, and dozens of other supplies that could mean the difference between life and death. The flight to the ambush site took 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. Through the helicopter's open door, I could see the mountainous terrain rushing past below. The pilot's voice crackled through my headset. "LZ is going to be rough. We'll have maybe 90 seconds on the ground before we have to pull out." As we approached the landing zone, I could hear the staccato rhythm of gunfire echoing off the valley walls. Smoke was rising from several positions, where the squad had taken cover behind rocks and fallen trees. The helicopter touched down hard, and I sprinted toward the nearest wounded soldier. Sergeant Davis had taken shrapnel to his chest and was losing blood fast. I worked quickly, applying pressure dressings and starting in 4 while bullets whined overhead. "Stay with me, Davis," I shouted over the noise, "You're going home today." But as I was preparing to move him to the helicopter, I realized the situation was worse than I'd thought. 3 more soldiers were critically wounded, scattered across different positions. The helicopter couldn't wait, it was taking too much fire. "Mitchell, we have to go," the pilot shouted. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. "Take Davis and go. I'm staying with the others." The helicopter lifted off, leaving me alone with 11 soldiers and no guarantee of extraction. For the next 6 hours, I moved from position to position under constant enemy fire, treating wounds, administering pain medication, and keeping men alive through sheer determination and the contents of my medical kit. Private Torres had a sucking chest wound that would have killed him in minutes without immediate intervention. I performed an emergency needle decompression, inserting a catheter between his ribs to relieve the pressure on his collapsed lung. Corporal Baker had a compound fracture of his femur and was going into shock from blood loss. I applied a tourniquet and started to IVs, using my own body as a shield while I worked. The worst case was Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, the squad leader. He'd taken a round to the abdomen and was bleeding internally. There was nothing I could do except keep him comfortable and pray that help would arrive soon. I held his hand and told him about my family, about Denver, about anything that might keep him conscious and fighting. "My daughter," he whispered, "she's getting married next month. You're going to walk her down that aisle." I promised him, "I'm not going to let you miss it." As the sun began to set, I heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the rotor blades of incoming helicopters. Not just one, but 3, along with Apache gunships providing cover. The cavalry had arrived. The extraction was a blur of activity. We loaded the wounded as quickly as possible while the gunships kept the Taliban fighters at bay. As the last helicopter lifted off with me and the remaining soldiers aboard, I looked down at my hands. They were covered in blood, not my own, but the blood of 12 men whose lives I'd helped save. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes squeezed my hand as we flew toward the base hospital. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Thank you for staying." I didn't realize it then, but someone had been recording the radio communications throughout the entire incident. My voice, calm and professional under fire, was captured on tape as I called for supplies, coordinated medical care, and refused to leave wounded soldiers behind. That recording would eventually make its way up the chain of command, all the way to the Pentagon, but at that moment, all I cared about was that 12 good men were alive. And I had played a part in keeping them that way. My medical kit, now empty and stained with the evidence of 6 hours of intensive combat medicine, had served its purpose. I never imagined that 6 hours in a valley in Afghanistan would one day bring me to the White House. Coming home from Afghanistan should have been a celebration. Instead, it felt like stepping into a world that no longer made sense. The transition from combat medic to civilian was jarring in ways I hadn't anticipated. One day I was making life or death decisions under enemy fire, and the next I was standing in a grocery store, overwhelmed by the simple choice between 12 different brands of cereal. The PTSD diagnosis came 3 months after my return. The official letter from the VA was clinical in its language: post-traumatic stress disorder, moderate to severe, service-connected disability rating 70%. Those words on paper couldn't capture the reality of waking up in cold sweats, of diving for cover when a car backfired, of feeling like I was constantly waiting for the next crisis that never came. Dr. Patterson, my therapist at the VA, explained that what I was experiencing was normal for someone who'd been through combat trauma. "Your brain is still in survival mode," she said during one of our sessions. "It's going to take time to readjust to civilian life." But my family saw it differently. To them, I wasn't recovering from trauma, I was broken, damaged, a shadow of who I used to be. The daughter who had left for Afghanistan might not have been their favorite, but at least she'd been functional. The woman who came back was someone they didn't recognize and didn't want to understand. The first family dinner after my return was a disaster. I'd been looking forward to it for weeks, imagining sharing stories of my service, finally having something that might make them proud. Instead, I found myself jumping at every sudden noise, my hands shaking as I tried to cut my steak. "Sarah, you're making everyone uncomfortable," Mom whispered when I flinched at the sound of Jake dropping his fork. That night, I heard them talking in the kitchen after they thought I'd gone to bed. "She's not the same," Dad said, his voice heavy with Disappointment. I knew the military would change her, but this. Maybe she should see someone, Mom suggested, professional help. What she needs is to snap out of it, Dad replied. She can't use her military service as an excuse forever. Those words cut deeper than any shrapnel ever could. I wasn't using my service as an excuse. I was trying to heal from wounds they couldn't see. But they interpreted my struggle as weakness, as confirmation that joining the military had been a mistake. The nightmares were the worst part. I'd wake up screaming, reliving that day in Kandahar or other combat situations where I'd lost patience despite my best efforts. The sound of helicopters would send me into panic attacks. Crowded places became impossible to navigate without feeling trapped and vulnerable. Mom started making excuses for my behavior when friends or neighbors asked about me. She's having trouble adjusting. Became her standard response, delivered with the same tone she might use to explain why a houseplant was dying. The breaking point came during Jake's engagement party. He was marrying his law school girlfriend, Amanda, and the whole extended family had come to celebrate. I'd managed to attend despite my anxiety, hoping to be part of something positive for once. But when Uncle Mike asked about my military service, I could see Mom tense up across the room. She quickly changed the subject, steering the conversation toward Jake's recent promotion. Later, when a family friend mentioned seeing a news story about veterans with PTSD, Mom actually said, "Thank goodness Jake chose a stable career path." I excused myself and went outside, needing air and space. Jake found me sitting on the back porch, staring up at the stars, a habit I developed in Afghanistan. "You okay, sis?" he asked. Settling down beside me, for a moment I thought about telling him everything, about the nightmares, about feeling lost and broken, about how much our parents' attitude was hurting me, but instead, I just nodded. Yeah, just needed some quiet. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I know Mom and Dad don't really get it, but what you did over there, it matters, right?" It was the closest thing to understanding I'd gotten from any of them, and it brought tears to my eyes. "Yeah," I whispered, "it matters." But even Jake's small gesture of support couldn't erase the damage that had been done. I was living in my childhood bedroom, unable to hold down a steady job because of my symptoms, watching my family tiptoe around me like I was a ticking time bomb. The diagnosis letter became a symbol of everything I was struggling with: official recognition of my invisible wounds, but also proof to my family that the military had indeed ruined me, just as they'd feared it would. What they didn't understand was that I wasn't broken because of my service. I was struggling to heal from serving my country, and their lack of support was making that healing nearly impossible, while I was struggling to rebuild my life after Afghanistan. Jake's career was soaring to new heights. The partnership certificate from Morrison, Bradley and Associates arrived on a Thursday morning, and you would have thought he'd won the Nobel Prize based on my parents' reaction. Partner track at 27. Dad announced to anyone who would listen, youngest associate in the firm's history to be considered for partnership. The certificate itself was beautiful, thick, cream-colored paper with embossed lettering and the firm's official seal. It represented everything my parents valued: prestige, financial success, social status, and stability. Jake had it framed within a week and hung it prominently in his downtown apartment. The celebration dinner was held at the most expensive restaurant in Denver. I was invited, of course. But it was clear I was there to fill out the family photo, not because anyone particularly wanted me there. I sat quietly through course after course of congratulatory toasts, watching my parents beam with pride. To Jake, Dad raised his glass for the third time that evening. Who proved that hard work and dedication always pay off. The implication was clear, even if it wasn't stated directly. Jake had made something of himself through hard work and dedication, while I had taken the easy way out by joining the military, only to come back damaged and directionless. Jake's success story had become the family's favorite narrative. Born with natural intelligence, he'd excelled in school without much effort, earned a full scholarship to Harvard Law, graduated magna cum laude, and landed a position at one of Colorado's most prestigious law firms. His trajectory had been smooth, predictable, and thoroughly respectable. His specialty was corporate mergers and acquisitions, helping wealthy companies become even wealthier by buying out their competitors. He worked 80-hour weeks, billed clients at $400 per hour, and was already being mentioned as a potential candidate for the firm's executive committee. Jake bought a new BMW. Mom would tell the neighbors, fully loaded, leather interior, he's doing so well for himself. Or, Jake's thinking about buying a house in Cherry Hills. Can you imagine, our son, living in one of Denver's most exclusive neighborhoods? The contrast between their treatment of Jake and me became more pronounced after my return from deployment. While they celebrated every minor milestone in his career, they seemed embarrassed by my very existence. When people asked about me, the responses were vague and quickly redirected. Sarah's finding her way became Mom's standard deflection, usually followed immediately by, but Jake just closed a $10 million deal. The family gatherings were the worst. Jake would arrive in his expensive suits, carrying bottles of wine that cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. He'd regale everyone with stories from his law firm, name-dropping clients and describing deals that involved more money than most people would see in a lifetime. Meanwhile, I'd sit in the corner, trying not to flinch when someone laughed too loudly or a door slammed somewhere in the house. My contributions to conversations were met with polite but brief responses before the focus inevitably shifted back to Jake's latest achievement. The most painful part was watching how naturally pride and affection flowed from our parents too. Jake, Dad would clap him on the shoulder and say things like, "That's my boy." Mom would fuss over whether he was eating enough, working too hard, taking care of himself. Their love for him was obvious, unconditional and publicly celebrated. With me, every interaction felt forced and uncomfortable. They spoke to me with the careful tone people use around someone who might break at any moment. There were no shoulder claps, no proud proclamations, no maternal fussing. Just awkward concern about my situation and transparent relief when I made excuses to leave early. Jake, to his credit, occasionally seemed uncomfortable with the disparity in treatment. During one family barbecue, after Dad had spent 20 minutes bragging about Jake's latest case, my brother tried to redirect attention to me. Double quotes, "Sarah, didn't you say you were looking into some volunteer opportunities?" he asked. Before I could answer, Mom jumped in. "Oh, that's nice, dear, but we shouldn't overtax you. You need to focus on getting better first." The message was clear. Jake was achieving great things while I was still too broken to be trusted with anything important. His partnership certificate represented everything I wasn't: successful, stable, worthy of pride and celebration. That certificate hanging on his wall became a daily reminder of the gulf between us, and of everything my parents wished I could have been instead of what I was. The stack of rejection letters on my desk told the story of my civilian life better than any words could. Application after application, interview after interview, all ending the same way: "Thank you for your interest, but we've decided to go with another candidate." Finding employment as a veteran with PTSD proved nearly impossible. On paper, my qualifications looked impressive: combat medic training, leadership experience, ability to work under extreme pressure, but in practice, my condition made me unreliable in ways that employers couldn't overlook. I'd had to leave 3 different jobs due to panic attacks. A position at a local clinic ended when I froze during a medical emergency, transported back to that valley in Kandahar by the sound of sirens. An office job at an insurance company lasted 2 weeks before I couldn't handle the fluorescent lights and constant background noise. Even a part-time position at a veterinary clinic ended badly when the smell of antiseptic triggered flashbacks so severe I had to be sedated. Each failure was documented in polite but firm termination letters that cited performance issues and inability to meet position requirements. The rejection pile grew thicker each month, a paper monument to my civilian inadequacies. My parents' reaction to each job loss followed a predictable pattern. First came disappointment, then frustration, and finally resignation that their daughter simply couldn't function in the real world. "Maybe you're not ready to work yet," Mom would say after each setback, her tone suggesting that my readiness was entirely a matter of choice. Dad was more direct. "You need to learn to compartmentalize, Sarah. Everyone has bad days, but successful people don't let their personal problems interfere with their professional obligations." They couldn't understand that PTSD wasn't something I could simply compartmentalize or overcome through willpower. It was a rewiring of my brain's threat detection system, an involuntary response to stimuli that reminded me of combat. But to them, it looked like weakness, like an excuse for failure. The worst part was how their attitude affected other people's perception of me at family gatherings. I could see relatives whispering about poor Sarah who can't seem to get her life together. Children who used to run up to me for hugs now approached hesitantly, confused by the adults' careful treatment of their aunt. Mom's conversations with neighbors became exercises in damage control. I'd overhear her on the phone, spinning my situation in the most positive light possible while clearly being embarrassed by the reality. Sarah's taking some time to figure out her next steps. She'd say, followed by, you know how it is with young people these days, so many options, it's hard to choose. But I knew what the neighbors were really thinking when they saw me coming and going at odd hours, clearly not maintaining regular employment. I could see it in their polite but distant greetings, in the way conversations stopped when I approached, in their quick redirections to safer topics when my situation came up. The isolation became overwhelming. My military friends were scattered across the country, dealing with their own reintegration challenges. My high school friends had moved on with their lives, careers, marriages, children. While I felt stuck in a perpetual state of dysfunction, I started avoiding social situations altogether. Family dinners became exercises in silent endurance. I'd sit through Jake's latest career updates, nodding politely while internally screaming at the unfairness of it all. His success seemed effortless while every day was a struggle for me just to get out of bed. The breaking point came during a particularly brutal job interview for a position at a physical therapy clinic. The interviewer, a well-meaning woman in her 50s, spent most of our time together asking probing questions about my reliability and emotional stability. We need someone who can handle stressful situations without becoming overwhelmed, she explained. Our patients depend on consistency. I wanted to tell her that I'd handled stress that would break most people, that I'd saved lives under enemy fire, that my emotional instability was the result of serving my country with honor. Instead, I nodded and assured her that I was committed to professional excellence. The rejection letter arrived 3 days later. That night, I sat in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by the rejection letters and feeling like a complete failure. 28 years old, living with my parents, unable to hold down a basic job. Watching my younger brother achieve everything our parents had dreamed of while I couldn't even manage to function in civilian society. I didn't know then that my darkest moment was about to become the prelude to the most important phone call of my life. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning, while I was sitting in my pajamas, scrolling through job listings and fighting off another wave of despair. The number was unfamiliar, and normally I would have let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. Is this Sarah Mitchell? The voice was professional, female, with a slight southern accent. Double quotes. Yes, this is Sarah, Ms. Mitchell. This is Margaret Stevens from the White House Office of Presidential Correspondence. I'm calling regarding your military service record. I almost hung up, assuming it was some kind of scam. The White House didn't call people like me, but something in the woman's tone made me pause. I'm sorry, could you repeat that? I'm calling from the White House, Ms. Mitchell. We've been reviewing your service record, specifically your actions during the incident in Kandahar province on March 15, 2018. The president would like to speak with you personally. My heart started racing. I don't understand. What incident? The ambush where you remained behind to treat wounded soldiers despite being under enemy fire for 6 hours. Your actions saved 12 lives, Ms. Mitchell. The president wants to thank you personally and present you with the Medal of Honor. The words hit me like a physical blow. Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the United States, reserved for acts of valor that go above and beyond the call of duty. I'd heard of it, of course, but it belonged to heroes from history books, not to someone like me. There must be some mistake, I stammered. I just did my job. I'm a medic, that's what medics do. Ms. Mitchell, staying behind enemy lines for 6 hours to treat wounded soldiers while under constant fire is not just doing your job. It's extraordinary heroism. The recommendation has been working its way through the proper channels for 3 years. And it's finally reached the president's desk. The room started spinning. I sat down hard on my bed, trying to process what I was hearing. 3 years, these things take time. Especially when the paperwork has to be reconstructed from combat records and witness statements. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, whom you treated that day, has been advocating for your recognition since he recovered. He's the one who made sure your actions didn't go unnoticed, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes. I remembered him, the squad leader with the abdominal wound, who'd been worried about missing his daughter's wedding. He'd survived. Is he okay? He's doing very well, Ms. Mitchell. He did walk his daughter down the aisle, just as you promised him. And he's been working tirelessly to make sure you receive the recognition you deserve. Tears started streaming down my face. For 3 years, I'd been struggling with feeling like a failure, like my service hadn't mattered, like I was broken and worthless, and all that time, someone had been fighting to make sure I was recognized for what I'd done. The ceremony will be held at the White House next Friday, Margaret continued. We'll arrange for your transportation and accommodations. The president specifically requested that this be a priority. I don't know what to say. Just say, you'll be there, Ms. Mitchell. The country needs to see heroes like you. Young people, especially young women, need to see that service and sacrifice are still valued. After I hung up, I sat in stunned silence for what felt like hours. The official invitation arrived by courier later that day, thick, cream-colored paper with the presidential seal embossed at the top. The President of the United States requests the honor of your presence at a ceremony recognizing your extraordinary service to your country. I read it over and over, each time expecting the words to change, expecting to wake up from some elaborate dream, but the letterhead was real. The weight of the paper was real, and the magnitude of what was happening was slowly starting to sink in. That evening, I called my parents into the living room. They came reluctantly, probably expecting another update on my job search failures or therapy appointments. I have something to tell you, I began, holding the invitation in my trembling hands. What is it now, Sarah? Dad asked, settling into his chair with a sigh. I took a deep breath. The president wants to give me the Medal of Honor. The silence that followed was deafening. Mom looked at me like I'd announced I was moving to Mars. Dad's expression cycled through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. Sarah, Mom said carefully, That's wonderful, but are you sure you understood correctly? Maybe it was. I'm sure, Mom. The White House called. They're flying me to Washington next Friday. I handed them the invitation. Dad's hands shook as he read it, his face going pale. Mom read it over his shoulder, her mouth opening and closing without making any sound. For the first time in 3 years, my parents looked at me with something other than disappointment or pity. They looked at me with shock, confusion, and the dawning realization that maybe their daughter wasn't the failure they'd believed her to be. The family dinner that night was unlike any we'd had in years, maybe ever. For once, I wasn't the uncomfortable afterthought sitting quietly while Jake dominated the conversation. Instead, I was the center of attention, and my parents didn't quite know how to handle it. Mom had insisted on making my favorite meal, pot roast with mashed potatoes, something she hadn't done since before my deployment. The dinner table felt different somehow, charged with an energy that came from everyone trying to process information that didn't fit their understanding of who I was. Tell us exactly what happened, Dad said, cutting his meat with unusual precision. What did you do to earn this honor? I took a deep breath and began describing that day in Kandahar. As I spoke, I watched their faces change. Dad's fork paused halfway to his mouth when I described staying behind with the wounded soldiers. Mom's eyes widened when I explained performing medical procedures under enemy fire. You stayed behind voluntarily? Jake asked, his lawyer's mind focusing on the details. Even though you could have been killed, they needed help, I said simply. I couldn't leave them. 12 men, Dad repeated slowly, as if trying to make the number feel real. You saved 12 men. We all saved them. The helicopter crews, the Apache pilots, the ground forces who provided cover. I just did my part, but even as I downplayed my role, I could see something shifting in their expressions. The woman sitting across from them wasn't the broken, jobless daughter they'd grown accustomed to disappointing them. She was someone who had made life or death decisions and saved lives. Mom reached across the table and took my hand, the first physical affection she'd shown me in months. Sarah, why didn't you tell us about this before? I tried to, I said quietly. I called home that night to tell you about the soldiers I'd helped. But you were more interested in Jake's promotion. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of 3 years of missed opportunities, dismissed achievements, and casual dismissals of my service. Jake cleared his throat. Sarah, I had no idea. When you talked about your deployment, I thought you meant routine medical stuff, not this. You never asked for details, I pointed out, without malice but with complete honesty. Dad set down his fork and looked directly at me for what felt like the first time in years. The Medal of Honor. He said slowly, that's the highest military decoration there is, yes, and the President of the United States is personally giving it to you. Yes. Mom pulled out her phone and started typing frantically. I need to look this up. I need to understand what this means, as she read from various websites. Her voice grew quieter and more amazed. It says here that fewer than 3,500 people have ever received the Medal of Honor. Sarah, do you understand how rare this is? I did understand. But I could see they were just beginning to grasp the magnitude of what was happening. Their daughter, the one they'd written off as a failure, the one they'd been embarrassed by, the one they'd wished would snap out of it, was about to receive the nation's highest honor for heroism. Who else knows about this? Jake asked. Just U.S. so far and Lieutenant Colonel Hayes. Apparently, he's been advocating for this recognition since he recovered. The man whose life you saved, Mom said, reading from her phone. It says here that Medal of Honor recipients often have advocates who push for their recognition. He never forgot what you did. The irony wasn't lost on me that a stranger had been fighting for my recognition, while my own family had been hoping I'd fade quietly into the background. Dad pushed back from the table and walked to the window, staring out at the backyard where Jake and I had played as children. When he turned back, his eyes were bright with tears. Sarah, I owe you an apology. We all do. We've been so focused on what we thought success looked like that we missed the fact that we were living with a genuine American hero. Dad, you don't have to. Yes, I do. His voice was firm. I've been disappointed in you for not being able to hold down a regular job when you've already done something that most people could never do. I've been embarrassed by your struggles, when I should have been proud that you were struggling because you served your country with honor. Mom was crying now, openly and without trying to hide it. All those times I told people you were finding your way, when I should have been telling them you were a war hero. The word hung in the air between us. Hero, it felt strange coming from their lips, directed at me. Jake reached over and squeezed my shoulder. I'm proud of you, sis. I'm proud to be your brother. It was a beautiful moment. But I couldn't shake the feeling that their pride was contingent on external validation. They weren't proud of me because I'd served honorably. They were proud because the president was about to recognize me. Would they have felt the same way if this call had never come? Still, sitting around that dinner table, feeling like part of the family for the first time in years, I allowed myself to enjoy the moment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, I was their daughter again, not their disappointment. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of frantic typing, coming from downstairs. I found my parents at the kitchen table, both hunched over their laptops, frantically searching for information about my military service. The transformation from the night before was remarkable. They had become amateur military historians overnight. Sarah, Mom called out when she saw me. Come look at this. I found a news article from 2018 about the Kandahar incident. She'd found a brief Associated Press report that mentioned an unidentified army medic who had remained behind to treat wounded soldiers during a Taliban ambush. The article praised the medic's heroism but didn't include names or specific details. That's you, Dad said, his voice filled with wonder. You're the unidentified medic. He'd pulled up my military service record from the Army's public database. There it was in black and white, my deployments, my unit assignments, my decorations, and my service-connected disability rating. Everything they'd never bothered to ask about was right there. Documented and official. Purple Heart, Mom read aloud. Combat Medical Badge. Army Commendation Medal. Sarah, you have so many awards. Why didn't you ever show us these? Dad asked, holding up his laptop screen. I did, I reminded them gently. They're in a box in my closet upstairs. I showed them to you when I came home. But you seemed more interested in discussing my job prospects. They exchanged guilty looks. I could see them remembering those early conversations. Probably recalling how they'd dismissed my military decorations as consolation prizes for a career that had left me damaged. Jake arrived around noon carrying coffee for everyone and a thick folder of printed documents. His legal training had kicked in, and he'd spent the morning researching Medal of Honor recipients and the criteria for the award. Do you realize how extraordinary this is? He asked, spreading papers across the dining room table. The Medal of Honor requires conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and bay. On the call of duty, Sarah, you literally risked your life to save others. That's what soldiers do, I said, uncomfortable with the growing reverence in their voices. No, Jake corrected, consulting his research. That's what heroes do. The vast majority of soldiers serve honorably without ever being in a situation that calls for this level of sacrifice. Mom had found the contact information for Lieutenant Colonel Hayes and was debating whether to call him. I want to thank him, she said, for not letting your actions be forgotten. I want to understand what really happened, Dad added. I want to know exactly what you did that day. Over the next several hours, I found myself recounting the events of March 15, 2018 in more detail than I'd ever shared with anyone outside of military debriefings. I described the helicopter ride to the ambush site, the sound of gunfire echoing off the valley walls, the difficult decision to stay behind when extraction became impossible. As I spoke, I watched my parents' understanding of me fundamentally shift. The daughter they'd seen as broken and directionless was revealed to be someone who had made split-second decisions under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. The woman they'd worried couldn't handle civilian employment had handled life-or-death situations with calm professionalism. You performed surgery under enemy fire, Mom said, her voice barely above a whisper. Field medicine, I corrected. Not surgery. You saved Lieutenant Colonel Hayes' life specifically, Dad noted, consulting Jake's research. He's gone on to have a distinguished career. He retired as a full colonel last year. They'd found several references to Hayes in military publications, including an interview where he mentioned the medic who stayed behind without naming me specifically. In every reference, he spoke about that day as a turning point, both in the immediate battle and in his understanding of what military service really meant. He's been nominating you for this award for 3 years, Jake said, showing me printouts of various military forums where Hayes had advocated for recognition of unnamed heroes. He never gave up. The most surprising discovery came from Mom's social media detective work. She'd found Hayes' daughter's wedding photos from 2018, posted on Facebook with public privacy settings. There was Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, walking his daughter down the aisle, exactly as he'd worried he might not be able to do while bleeding in that valley. You made that possible, Mom said, tears streaming down her face. That father walking his daughter down the aisle, you made that happen. For the first time since my return from Afghanistan, I felt like my parents were truly seeing me, not the damaged veteran they'd been embarrassed by, not the unemployable daughter who couldn't get her life together, but the person who had made choices that mattered, who had served with honor, who had earned recognition at the highest levels. Dad closed his laptop and looked at me directly. Sarah, I need you to know something. I've been wrong about everything, about your service, about your struggles, about what success looks like. You've already achieved more than most people ever will, and I've been too blind to see it. But even as I appreciated their newfound understanding, I couldn't shake the feeling that their pride was still dependent on external validation. They were proud now because the president was recognizing me, because Lieutenant Colonel Hayes had advocated for me, because the documentation proved my worth. Would they have been proud if this call had never come? Would they have eventually learned to see my service as valuable without a Medal of Honor to validate it? I didn't know the answer, but for now, it was enough that they were finally trying to understand who their daughter really was. The first media contact came Thursday morning. 2 days before I was scheduled to fly to Washington, I was drinking coffee and trying to process the surreal turn my life had taken when the phone rang. The caller ID showed a local number I didn't recognize. Ms. Mitchell? This is Jennifer Walsh from Channel 7 News. We understand you're receiving the Medal of Honor from the President tomorrow. Would you be available for an interview? I nearly dropped my coffee mug. How did you find out about that Medal of Honor? Ceremonies are public events. Ms. Mitchell, the White House released the information to the press this morning. You're going to be Colorado's first female Medal of Honor recipient since World War II. After hanging up, I immediately called the White House contact number Margaret Stevens had given me. She confirmed that the ceremony details had been released to the media as part of standard protocol. You should expect significant interest, she warned me. Medal of Honor recipients, especially young women, tend to attract substantial media attention. The president's office will help coordinate any interviews you're comfortable giving. By noon, our quiet suburban street had become a circus. 3 news vans were parked outside our house, and reporters were approaching neighbors for interviews about the war hero next door. I watched from behind the living room curtains as Mrs. Peterson from across the street spoke enthusiastically to a camera crew, gesturing toward our house. Mom answered the doorbell for the 4th time that hour. This time it was David Chen from the Denver Post, holding a digital recorder and looking professional but persistent. Mrs. Mitchell, I'm hoping to speak with your daughter about her upcoming ceremony. This is a significant honor for Colorado. She's not ready to speak to the press yet, Mom said. But I could hear uncertainty in her voice. We hadn't discussed how to handle media attention because we hadn't expected any. Jake arrived within an hour of my calling him, armed with his legal expertise and a crash course in media relations he'd apparently researched during his drive over. You need to control this narrative, he advised. One interview with a respected outlet, on your terms, then refer everyone else to that piece. We decided on Jennifer Walsh from Channel 7. Partly because she'd been the first to call and partly because Jake had looked up her previous work and deemed it respectful and professional. The interview would take place in our backyard, away from the crowd of reporters gathered on the street. Jennifer arrived at 3 p.m. with a small crew, just a cameraman and a sound technician. She was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 30s, with kind eyes and a reassuring manner. I want you to know, she said as her crew set up, that I've done my research on the Medal of Honor and what it represents. This isn't going to be a fluff piece. I want to tell the real story of what you did and what it means. The interview lasted about 20 minutes. Jennifer asked thoughtful questions about my military service, the events in Kandahar, and my transition back to civilian life. When she asked about my family's reaction to the news, I chose my words carefully. They're very proud, I said, which was true. Even if it had taken a presidential phone call to get them there, what would you say to other young women who might be inspired by your service? I'd say that service comes in many forms, I replied. Military service is just one way to contribute to something larger than yourself. The important thing is to find what matters to you and be willing to sacrifice for it. After the crew left, we gathered around the television to watch the evening news. There I was on the local 6 o'clock broadcast, identified as Sarah Mitchell, 28, Colorado's newest Medal of Honor recipient. The segment included the interview, background information about the Kandahar incident, and commentary from military experts about the significance of the award. But the most surprising part came at the end, when Jennifer interviewed several of our neighbors. Mrs. Peterson, whom I'd known since childhood, spoke glowingly about me. Sarah has always been special, she told the camera, quiet but determined. We're so proud to have a hero living right here in our neighborhood, Mr. Rodriguez from Two Houses Down added. I had no idea what she'd done over there. It makes you realize you never really know what people have been through. The segment ended with Jennifer's closing commentary. Sarah Mitchell's story reminds us that heroes often walk among us unrecognized, and that the true measure of service isn't always visible to those around us. As the news moved on to other stories, I felt a strange mixture of validation and discomfort. It was gratifying to have my service acknowledged publicly, but surreal to see my life treated as a news story. My phone started buzzing immediately after the broadcast aired. Text messages from high school classmates I hadn't heard from in years, Facebook friend requests from people I barely remembered, and calls from other news outlets requesting interviews. But the message that meant the most came from Staff Sergeant Williams, my mentor from Afghanistan, who had somehow gotten my number. Saw you on the news. So proud of you, Mitchell. You always were a hero, now everyone else knows it too. That night, lying in bed and listening to the unusual quiet of our street, the news crews had finally left. I reflected on how quickly everything had changed. 3 days ago, I was an unemployed veteran struggling with PTSD. Now I was Colorado's war hero, scheduled to meet the President of the United States in less than 18 hours. The media attention was just the beginning. Tomorrow, everything would change again. The morning of my flight to Washington, I woke up at 5 a.m., 2 hours before my alarm. My dress uniform hung on the closet door, freshly pressed and adorned with the ribbons and decorations I'd earned during my service. It had been 3 years since I'd worn it, and seeing it there made everything feel real in a way it hadn't before. The car service arrived at 7 a.m. to take me to Denver International Airport. As we pulled away from the house, I saw neighbors standing on their porches, some waving, others just watching. Mrs. Peterson held up her phone to take a picture. The quiet suburban street, where I'd felt like a failure just days before, now felt like the launching point for something extraordinary. At the airport, I was escorted through a special security line and taken to a private waiting area. Other passengers stared as I walked through the terminal in my dress uniform, some nodding respectfully, others taking discreet photos. The attention was overwhelming but not unwelcome for once. People were looking at me with pride rather than pity. The flight to Washington was my first time in first class, courtesy of the White House Travel Office. As we took off, I watched Denver shrink below us and tried to process the magnitude of what was about to happen. In a few hours, I would be standing in the East Room of the White House, receiving the nation's highest military honor from the President of the United States. Margaret Stevens met me at Reagan National Airport, accompanied by a military aide and a small security detail. She was exactly as I'd imagined from her voice, professional, warm, and clearly experienced at managing high-profile events. "How are you feeling, Ms. Mitchell?" she asked as we walked toward a waiting car. "Nervous," I admitted, "and a little overwhelmed." "That's completely normal. Today is about celebrating your service and sacrifice. Try to enjoy it." The drive through Washington was unlike anything I'd experienced. Our escort included police motorcycles and black SUVs, and traffic was diverted to clear our path. I watched the familiar landmarks pass by: the Lincoln Memorial, the Washington Monument, the Capitol building, and marveled that I was being given this kind of treatment. Our first stop was the Pentagon, where I met with other Medal of Honor recipients who would be attending the ceremony. These were men whose stories I'd heard in military training, legends of military service spanning from World War II to Iraq and Afghanistan, yet they welcomed me as an equal, sharing stories and offering advice about handling the attention that comes with the medal. "The hardest part," said Command Sergeant Major Williams, a Vietnam veteran, "is remembering that you're not just representing yourself anymore. You're representing everyone who served, everyone who didn't make it home, everyone whose stories won't be told. That's a heavy responsibility, but it's also an honor." Colonel Martinez, who'd received his medal for actions in Iraq, added, "Don't let anyone make you feel like you don't deserve this. The review process is thorough. If you're here, it's because you earned it." Their acceptance meant more to me than any media coverage could. These were people who understood what it meant to make split-second decisions under fire, who knew the weight of responsibility that comes with serving others before yourself. The afternoon was spent in briefings about the ceremony protocol, meeting with White House staff, and preparing for the media attention that would follow. I learned that the ceremony would be attended by members of Congress, military leadership, and my family, who had flown in earlier that morning. The most surreal moment came when I was given my boarding pass for the return flight, not a regular boarding pass, but one marked with the presidential seal. I was flying home on Air Force One, a privilege extended to Medal of Honor recipients as a gesture of respect from the Commander-in-Chief. As evening approached, I found myself in a hotel room just blocks from the White House, looking out at the city where the most important decisions in the world are made daily. Tomorrow morning, I would walk into the most famous house in America, not as a tourist or a visitor, but as a guest of honor. My phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "Saw you on the national news tonight. The whole family is so proud, can't wait to see you tomorrow." Another message came from Lieutenant Colonel Hayes. "Sarah, it's been a long time coming, but tomorrow justice will be done. Thank you for saving my life and the lives of 11 other soldiers. You are the definition of an American hero." That night, lying in a hotel bed just miles from where I would receive the Medal of Honor, I thought about the journey that had brought me here, from the disappointed daughter who couldn't hold down a civilian job to a recognized American hero in less than a week. It felt like someone else's life, but the weight of the moment was unmistakably real. Tomorrow, I would stand before the President of the United States and accept recognition for the most important 6 hours of my life. After years of feeling like my service didn't matter, I was about to learn just how much it had meant to the people whose lives I'd saved and the country I'd served. The morning of the ceremony, I woke up in my hotel room at 6 a.m., my stomach churning with a mixture of excitement and terror. In 3 hours, I would be standing in the East Room of the White House, receiving the Medal of Honor from the President of the United States. No amount of preparation could make that feel normal. Margaret Stevens arrived at 7:30 to escort me to the White House. As our car approached the iconic building, I felt an overwhelming sense of surrealism. The White House, which I'd only seen in movies and on television, was now my destination, not for a tour, but for a ceremony in my honor. Security was unlike anything I'd experienced. Multiple checkpoints, background verification, and a thorough review of everyone who would be in attendance. The level of protection and protocol made it clear that this wasn't just another military ceremony, this was a presidential event. The East Room was breathtaking. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating the formal portraits of past presidents and the elegant chandeliers that had witnessed countless historic moments. Chairs were arranged in precise rows, with a podium bearing the presidential seal positioned at the front of the room. My family was already seated in the front row when I arrived. Mom was wearing her best dress and looking more nervous than I'd ever seen her. Dad sat ramrod straight in his suit, occasionally glancing around the room with visible awe. Jake was taking discreet photos with his phone, probably documenting every detail to share later. But the most emotional moment came when I saw Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, now Colonel Hayes, seated with his family. He looked older than I remembered, with more gray in his hair and deeper lines around his eyes, but his smile was warm and proud. When our eyes met, he mouthed thank you and pointed to his daughter, a young woman in her 20s, who looked so much like him. Other attendees included members of Congress, Pentagon leadership, and several fellow Medal of Honor recipients who had come to welcome me into their brotherhood. The room hummed with quiet conversation and an undercurrent of anticipation. At exactly 10 a.m., the ceremonial announcements began. Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States. The President entered the room with the confidence and presence that comes with the office. He was shorter than I'd expected but carried himself with unmistakable authority. As he approached the podium, the room fell into respectful silence. Today, we gather to honor a true American hero. The President began, his voice carrying clearly through the room. Staff Sergeant Sarah Mitchell represents the very best of our military courage under fire, dedication to others, and an unwillingness to abandon those who depend on her. He continued with a detailed account of the events in Kandahar, describing the tactical situation and the decision I'd made to stay behind with the wounded soldiers. Hearing the President of the United States recount those events gave them a weight and significance I'd never fully appreciated. For 6 hours, Staff Sergeant Mitchell remained under enemy fire, treating wounded soldiers and keeping them alive through her skill, determination, and absolute refusal to give up. Her actions saved 12 lives and exemplified the highest traditions of military service. As he spoke, I glanced at my parents. Mom was crying openly, her hand clutched in Dad's. They were hearing the full story of that day for the first time, in this level of detail, and I could see the impact it was having on them. The President then invited me to step forward. Walking across that room, with everyone watching, was one of the longest walks of my life, but when I reached the podium and faced the President of the United States, a sense of calm settled over me. Staff Sergeant Mitchell, he said, holding the Medal of Honor, a star-shaped medal suspended from a blue ribbon dotted with white stars, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. The President of the United States takes pride in presenting the Medal of Honor to Staff Sergeant Sarah J. Mitchell, United States Army. As he placed the medal around my neck, the weight of it was surprising, not just the physical weight of the medal itself, but the symbolic weight of everything it represented. The President shook my hand and leaned in to speak quietly. The country owes you a debt we can never fully repay, he said. Thank you for your service and your sacrifice. The applause that followed was thunderous. As I turned to face the audience, I saw Colonel Hayes stand up first, followed immediately by every other person in the room. The standing ovation lasted several minutes, and through it all, I felt a validation I'd never experienced before. After the formal ceremony, there was a reception where I had the chance to speak with attendees. Colonel Hayes approached me first, his daughter beside him. Sarah, he said, his voice thick with emotion, I can never thank you enough for what you did that day, not just for saving my life, but for giving me the chance to walk Emily down the aisle. His daughter Emily stepped forward and hugged me tightly. You gave me my father back, she whispered. Thank you. My parents approached next, both looking overwhelmed by everything they'd witnessed. Dad's eyes were red from crying, something I'd never seen before. Sarah, he said, struggling with his words, I owe you the biggest apology of my life. We've been so wrong about everything. You're not broken, you're extraordinary. And we've been too blind to see it. Mom nodded, unable to speak through her tears. The Medal of Honor certificate, signed by the president and bearing the official seal, was presented to me in a leather portfolio. It was tangible proof of recognition that I'd never imagined receiving, acknowledgement at the highest level that my service had mattered. As the ceremony concluded, and we prepared to leave the White House, I reflected on how completely my life had changed in the span of a week. I was no longer the struggling veteran that my family pitied. I was a Medal of Honor recipient, an American hero recognized by the president himself. But more than that, I finally felt like the person I'd always known I could be if given the chance to prove it. The transformation from anonymous veteran to national hero happened overnight. When I woke up in my hotel room the morning after the ceremony, my phone had over 200 missed calls, 500 text messages, and thousands of social media notifications. The Medal of Honor ceremony had been broadcast live and covered extensively by every major news outlet in the country. Margaret Stevens called at 7 a.m. to brief me on the media requests that were pouring in. Good morning, America wants you for Monday. 60 Minutes is requesting an exclusive, and Time magazine wants to feature you on their cover, she said, reading from what sounded like a very long list. Time magazine, I remembered seeing it in grocery store checkout lines, featuring presidents and world leaders, celebrities and Nobel Prize winners. Now they wanted to put my face on that same cover. Alongside the headline American Hero, the medic who saved 12 lives. The photo shoot took place that afternoon in a Washington studio. The photographer, a woman named Rebecca Chen who had shot covers for every major publication, directed me through dozens of poses, some in my dress uniform, others in civilian clothes, all designed to capture what she called the dignity of service. You have an interesting face for photography, she said as she adjusted the lighting. There's strength there, but also vulnerability. It tells a story. The cover shot ended up being a close-up of me in my dress uniform, the Medal of Honor visible around my neck, with an expression that Rebecca described as quietly confident. When I saw the final image weeks later, I barely recognized myself. The woman in that photograph looked sure of herself, proud, unbroken. The 60 Minutes interview was scheduled for the following week, but I agreed to a brief segment on Good Morning America before flying home. Sitting across from the anchor in the New York studio, I felt the weight of representing not just myself but all veterans, especially women in combat roles. What would you say to young women who might be inspired by your story? The anchor asked. I'd say that service isn't about being fearless, I replied. It's about doing what needs to be done despite being afraid. And that applies whether you're in combat or just trying to make a difference in your community. The interview was watched by over 4 million people, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. My social media accounts, which had been dormant for months, suddenly had tens of thousands of followers. The messages ranged from thank you notes from fellow veterans to expressions of pride from complete strangers. But the most meaningful responses came from other women in the military. A young Marine wrote, "Thank you for showing us that we belong here." An Army captain stationed in Germany sent, "You've given us someone to look up to." The speaking requests started almost immediately. The veterans of foreign wars wanted me as their keynote speaker. Universities were offering substantial fees for graduation addresses. Corporate events, military galas, and nonprofit fundraisers all extended invitations. I accepted a few carefully selected engagements, starting with a speech at the Women in Military Service for America Memorial at Arlington National Cemetery. Standing before an audience of female veterans spanning 7 decades of service, I felt the profound responsibility that comes with being a symbol. We serve not because it's easy, I told them, but because someone has to. We serve not because we're fearless, but because we're willing to act despite our fears. And we serve not for recognition, but because the mission matters more than our individual comfort. The applause was thunderous, but it was the conversations afterward that meant the most. Women shared their own stories of service, sacrifice, and the challenges of being taken seriously in traditionally male roles. Many talked about struggling with PTSD, unemployment, and family relationships strained by military service. "You've given us a voice," said a Navy veteran who had served in Iraq. "For the first time, people are paying attention to what we've been saying all along." The media attention continued to build throughout the month. The Time magazine cover story was published with the headline "The Medics War: How Sarah Mitchell Became America's Newest Hero." The article detailed not just the events in Kandahar, but my struggles with PTSD and civilian reintegration, painting a complex portrait of modern military service. My parents framed that magazine cover and hung it in their living room right next to Jake's law school graduation photo. For the first time in my life, I had equal billing in the family gallery of achievements. The most surprising development was the impact on other Medal of Honor recipients. Suddenly, there was renewed interest in their stories, and several were invited to speak at events alongside me. The brotherhood I joined was ancient and distinguished, but my addition had brought new attention to all of their sacrifices. Colonel Martinez, whom I'd met at the Pentagon, called to thank me. "You've reminded people that heroes are still being made," he said. "That's a gift to all of us." As the weeks passed, I began to understand that my role had evolved beyond simply being a Medal of Honor recipient. I had become a symbol of female military service, of veteran resilience, and of the ongoing reality that heroes walk among us unrecognized every day. The transformation was complete. I was no longer Sarah Mitchell, the struggling veteran who couldn't hold down a job. I was Staff Sergeant Sarah Mitchell, Medal of Honor recipient, American hero, and voice for veterans across the country. But with that transformation came new challenges and the realization that fame, even for the best reasons, brings its own set of complications. The backlash against my parents began almost immediately after the Time magazine article was published. The piece included quotes from our neighbors and family friends, and the contrast between their current praise and their previous treatment of me was stark and obvious to readers across the country. Social media became a brutal arena of judgment. Screenshots of my mother's old Facebook posts circulated widely, posts where she'd made vague references to me struggling to find my place while celebrating Jake's every minor achievement. Comment sections filled with criticism of parents who had failed to support their veteran daughter. "How do you not know your own daughter is a hero?" read one typical comment that was shared thousands of times. "These parents should be ashamed of themselves," wrote another. "She was struggling with PTSD, and they treated her like a failure." The criticism wasn't limited to social media. Local newspapers picked up the story, interviewing neighbors who remembered seeing me coming and going at odd hours while my parents made excuses for my unemployment. Some of these neighbors, emboldened by the national attention, were surprisingly candid about what they'd witnessed. You could tell they were embarrassed by her. Mrs. Henderson from down the street told the Denver Post. They'd brag about their son's law career but barely mention Sarah. Now everyone knows why she was struggling, and it makes their treatment of her look pretty awful. The impact on Dad's dental practice was immediate and devastating. Several long-term patients canceled appointments, and new patient inquiries dropped to almost zero. The practice's online reviews were flooded with one-star ratings and comments like, "How can you trust a dentist who didn't support his veteran daughter?" Mom's real estate business suffered similarly. Home sellers began canceling listings, and buyers started working with other agents. Her professional reputation, built over 15 years, crumbled in a matter of weeks. Jake called me in a panic. After the situation escalated, "Sarah, you need to see what's happening. Mom and Dad are getting death threats. Someone threw eggs at their house last night." I was genuinely shocked by the severity of the backlash. While I'd been hurt by my family's treatment, I'd never wanted them to face public humiliation or financial ruin. The internet's capacity for righteous anger had far exceeded anything I'd anticipated. "I never asked for this," I told Jake. "I didn't give that interview to hurt them." "I know," he said. "But you need to understand, people are furious on your behalf. They see a war hero who was treated badly by her own family, and they want justice." The situation reached a breaking point when a local television station ambushed my parents outside Dad's office. The reporter, a young man clearly eager to make his mark, thrust a microphone in Mom's face and asked, "How do you feel about the criticism of how you treated your Medal of Honor recipient daughter?" Mom's response, captured on camera and broadcast that evening, was painful to watch. "We love Sarah," she said, clearly flustered and unprepared. "We've always been proud of her. People don't understand the full situation," but her defense sounded weak and rehearsed. And it only fueled more criticism. The clip went viral with viewers dissecting every word and facial expression for signs of genuine remorse versus damage control. Dad's attempts to salvage the situation were even worse. In a written statement to the local newspaper, he said, "Our family's private matters have been taken out of context. We've always supported Sarah's service, and we're proud of her achievements." But journalists quickly found contradictory evidence. A former neighbor shared a recording of Dad at a backyard barbecue, saying that Sarah's military service had ruined her for normal life. Another family friend provided screenshots of text messages where Mom had complained about having to deal with Sarah's drama. The documentation of their previous attitudes was overwhelming and undeniable. Every excuse they offered was countered by evidence of their actual behavior over the past 3 years. The breaking point came when someone created a Facebook page called Justice for Sarah Mitchell. The T attracted over 50,000 followers in a week. The page became a rallying point for criticism of my parents, with daily posts highlighting their hypocrisy and organizing boycotts of their businesses. Jake showed me some of the posts, and I was horrified by the viciousness of the attacks. People were calling my parents unpatriotic, shameful, and worse, someone had posted their home address with suggestions for peaceful protests. "This has to stop," I told Jake. "This isn't what I wanted." "Then you need to say something publicly," he replied. "You're the only one who can call off the mob." But I was conflicted. Part of me felt that my parents deserved to face consequences for their treatment of me. They had been embarrassed by my service, dismissive of my struggles, and proud only when external validation forced them to be. The criticism wasn't unfair, it was accurate. At the same time, I could see that the situation was spiraling beyond reasonable accountability into something cruel and destructive. My parents had made mistakes, but they didn't deserve to have their lives destroyed by an internet mob. The decision about how to respond would test everything I'd learned about forgiveness, justice, and what it really means to be the bigger person. The attempted reconciliation came in the form of an expensive dinner reservation and what I can only describe as a public relations campaign masquerading as family outreach. My parents, clearly advised by some kind of crisis management consultant, invited me to dinner at Denver's most exclusive restaurant, the kind of place where being seen matters more than the food. I should have realized their motivations when Mom suggested we dress nicely and mentioned that a photographer from the society pages might be there. This wasn't about healing our relationship, it was about damage control. The restaurant was exactly what I'd expected: all white tablecloths, crystal glasses, and waiters who spoke in hushed tones. My parents had clearly chosen it for its visibility and prestige, hoping that being photographed with me in such a setting would help rehabilitate their image. "Sarah, we want to discuss your future," Dad began once we'd ordered. "With all this attention you're receiving, there are tremendous opportunities opening up." "What kind of opportunities?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew where this was headed. "Speaking engagements, book deals, endorsement opportunities," Mom said, pulling out a folder of papers. "We've been contacted by several agents and publicists who want to represent you." I looked through the materials they'd brought: literary agents promising 6-figure book advances, speaking bureaus offering $50,000 per appearance, marketing companies wanting to use my story to sell everything from military gear to life insurance. "We think we should form a family company to manage these opportunities," Dad continued. "Pool our resources, share the benefits. After all, we're all part of your story." The audacity was breathtaking. For 3 years, they'd been embarrassed by my existence, making excuses for my struggles and treating my military service like a shameful family secret. Now that my service had been validated at the highest levels, they wanted to monetize it and cut themselves in for a share. "You want to profit from my military service?" I asked, keeping my voice level despite the anger building inside me. "We want to help you maximize your potential," Mom said, using the kind of corporate speak that probably came from their consultant. "As a family." Where was this family support when I was having panic attacks? When I couldn't hold down a job because of PTSD? When you told the neighbors that the military had ruined me? The silence that followed was heavy with guilt and calculation. I could see them mentally rehearsing responses that their consultant had probably prepared. Sarah Dead said finally. We know we made mistakes, we didn't understand what you were going through, but we're trying to make it right now, by taking a cut of my speaking fees, by supporting you in every way we can, Mom insisted. This attention won't last forever. You need to capitalize on it while you can. That's when I realized the full extent of their delusion. They thought this was all about fame and money. That my Medal of Honor was essentially a lottery ticket, that had made me suddenly valuable to them. They couldn't understand that it was about honor, service, and recognition of sacrifice. Jake, who had been quietly uncomfortable throughout this conversation, finally spoke up. Mom, Dad, I don't think this is the right approach. Stay out of this, Jake, Dad snapped. This is about Sarah's future. No, I said, standing up from the table. This is about your future. You're facing financial consequences for how you treated me. And now you want to use my success to bail yourselves out. The other diners were starting to stare, but I didn't care. 3 years of suppressed anger and hurt were finally finding their voice. You were ashamed of me when I was struggling, I continued, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. You made excuses for my existence and wished I would just disappear. Now that the president has validated my service, you want to be part of my success story. Sarah, please sit down. Mom whispered, glancing around at the other tables. People are watching, let them watch, I said. Maybe they'll learn something about what honor actually means. I pulled out my phone and called my lawyer. Yes, I'd hired one after the media attention began. Within an hour, he'd drafted and sent a cease and desist letter to my parents, formally prohibiting them from using my name, story, or image for any commercial purposes without my explicit written consent. The letter made it clear that any attempts to profit from my military service or Medal of Honor recognition would result in immediate legal action. It also established firm boundaries around media appearances and public statements about our family relationship. Jake walked me to my car after the disastrous dinner. Sarah, I'm sorry, he said. I tried to talk them out of this approach, but they wouldn't listen. I know you did, I replied, but I need you to understand something. I'm not just your sister anymore. I'm a Medal of Honor recipient, and that comes with responsibilities. I won't let anyone cheapen that honor, not even family. The next morning, my lawyer's letter was front-page news in the Denver Post. Medal of Honor recipient takes legal action against parents, read the headline, accompanied by details about my family's attempted commercialization of my service. The public reaction was swift and supportive. Veterans organizations praised my decision to protect the integrity of my military honors. Editorial writers applauded my refusal to let family pressure compromise my principles. But more importantly, the legal action sent a clear message to my parents. Their daughter was no longer the struggling veteran they could manipulate or ignore. I was now someone with resources, representation, and the moral authority that comes with national recognition. The boundaries were set. If they wanted a relationship with me moving forward, it would be on terms that honored both my service and my dignity. 6 months after receiving the Medal of Honor, I stood before a crowd of 500 people at the grand opening of the Sarah Mitchell Veterans Support Center in downtown Denver. The facility, funded by donations that poured in after my story became national news, represented everything I wished had existed when I came home from Afghanistan. The building itself was beautiful, modern but warm, with large windows that let in natural light and spaces designed specifically for veterans dealing with PTSD and transition challenges. There were private counseling rooms, group therapy spaces, job training facilities, and even a quiet garden where veterans could find peace when the world became too overwhelming. This center exists because people believe that veterans deserve more than just thank you for your service. I told the crowd, which included local officials, donors, and dozens of veterans who would benefit from the facility, they deserve comprehensive support, understanding, and resources to rebuild their civilian lives. The bronze plaque beside the entrance read, "The Sarah Mitchell Veterans Support Center, dedicated to healing, hope, and the belief that every veteran's service matters." But I'd insisted that the real dedication be to all veterans who struggled in silence, whose stories hadn't been told, whose sacrifices hadn't been recognized. Among the veterans in attendance was Maria Santos, a young woman who'd served in Iraq and was struggling with many of the same challenges I'd faced. 6 months ago, I was sleeping in my car, she told me after the ceremony. Now I have a job, an apartment, and hope. This place saved my life. The center was my answer to the question that had haunted me since receiving the Medal of Honor. What do you do with recognition this significant? How do you honor it while helping others who haven't received the same validation? The answer was to build something that lasted beyond news cycles and magazine covers. Something that would help veterans long after people forgot my name or my story. Jake had been instrumental in setting up the legal structure for the nonprofit organization that would run the center. In the months since the disastrous family dinner, he'd become my strongest advocate and closest ally. I'm proud of you, sis, he said as we watched veterans touring their new facility. This is what real success looks like. The relationship with my parents remained complicated but slowly improving. After the legal boundaries were established, they'd begun the difficult work of examining their own behavior and attitudes. Dad had started attending therapy to understand his reaction to my PTSD, and Mom had joined a support group for military families. Their apologies, when they finally came, were genuine rather than strategic. I was afraid, Dad admitted during one of our carefully structured family meetings. Afraid of your pain, afraid of not knowing how to help, afraid of admitting that I didn't understand what you'd been through. It was easier to be disappointed in you than to confront my own inadequacy. As a father, Mom's reckoning was even more painful to witness. I was embarrassed by something I should have been proud of, she said through tears. I cared more about what the neighbors thought than about supporting my own daughter. I failed you. In the most fundamental way. Their businesses had slowly recovered as the public saw them making genuine efforts to understand and support veterans. Dad's dental practice now offered free services to veterans, and Mom had specialized in helping military families navigate home purchases, but the healing was gradual and conditional. I'd learned that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting and rebuilding. Trust requires consistent action over time. Our relationship was no longer based on unconditional family loyalty but on mutual respect and earned trust. The most meaningful relationship that emerged from this experience was with my chosen family. Of fellow veterans, Staff Sergeant Williams had become a regular presence in my life, offering guidance as I navigated my new role as a public figure. Doc Martinez and I spoke weekly, sharing the challenges of civilian life and celebrating each other's victories. Colonel Hayes and his daughter Emily had become particularly close friends. Emily, now a social worker specializing in veteran services, often said that my actions in Kandahar had shaped not just her father's life but her own career path. You didn't just save his life, she told me, you saved our whole family's future. The speaking engagements continued, but I'd become more selective about which opportunities aligned with my mission of supporting veterans. Corporate events that just wanted to use my story for inspiration were politely declined. University commencements and military ceremonies that could genuinely impact young people's understanding of service became my priority. The foundation connected to the Veterans Center had grown beyond my wildest expectations. Donations continued to pour in from across the country, allowing us to expand services and plan additional facilities in other cities. What had started as recognition of one person's actions had become a national movement to better support all veterans. As I stood in the center's main common area that evening, watching veterans connect with each other and access resources that could change their lives, I felt a sense of purpose I'd never experienced before. The Medal of Honor had given me a platform, but this center would be my lasting legacy. The broken veteran who couldn't hold down a civilian job had become a force for change in how society supports those who serve. The recognition had been important, but the impact would endure long after the medals and ceremonies were forgotten. 1 year after receiving the Medal of Honor, I sat in my home office reading a letter that had arrived that morning from the White House. It was a personal note from the President, thanking me for my continued service to veterans and inviting me to serve on a new federal task force for veteran mental health services. The letter, written on official presidential stationery, reminded me how far I'd traveled from that dark period when my own family saw me as a failure. Your advocacy work has inspired policy changes that will impact thousands of veterans. The President wrote, your service continues to make a difference every single day. Through my window, I could see the garden I'd planted behind my new house, a modest place in a quiet neighborhood where I'd finally found peace. The garden included flowers that bloomed at different times throughout the year, ensuring that something was always growing, always bringing beauty into the world. It seemed like a perfect metaphor for the journey I'd been on. Some seasons had been barren and difficult, But with patience and proper care, growth was always possible. My relationship with my parents had stabilized into something healthier than it had ever been before. They'd learned to ask about my work at the Veterans Center, to listen when I talked about challenges facing other veterans, and to express pride in ways that felt genuine rather than performative. Dad had become one of the center's most dedicated volunteers, using his medical background to help with health screenings and referrals. "It's the least I can do," he said when I thanked him for his time. "I'm trying to make up for 3 years of not understanding what you needed." Mom had channeled her energy into fundraising for the center, using her social connections to organize events that had raised hundreds of thousands of dollars. Her approach was still enthusiastic, and sometimes over the top, but now, it was directed towards something that mattered. Jake had taken a leave of absence from his law firm to help establish veterans centers in 3 other cities. "I spent years climbing the corporate ladder," he told me, "but this work actually means something. You showed me what real success looks like." The centers had become my primary focus, though I continued to accept speaking engagements that could raise awareness about veteran issues. The Denver Center alone had served over 1,200 veterans in its first year, helping with everything from job placement to mental health services to housing assistance. Maria Santos, the veteran who had been homeless when the center opened, was now one of our most effective counselors. Her lived experience with the challenges of reintegration made her particularly skilled at connecting with newly transitioned veterans. "You taught us that our struggles don't define us," she said during our weekly staff meeting. "Our response to those struggles defines us." The Medal of Honor itself sat in a place of honor in my home office, but it was no longer the defining element of my identity. It had been a recognition of one day of service, but the work I was doing now was a continuation of that service on a much larger scale. Colonel Hayes and I spoke regularly about the responsibility that comes with recognition. "The medal was for what you did in one moment," he said during one of our conversations, "but your legacy will be determined by what you do with the platform it gave you." The platform had indeed proven powerful. Testimonies before Congress had led to increased funding for veteran mental health services. Media appearances had raised awareness about the challenges facing female veterans. The centers had become a model that other communities were replicating across the country. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in how I saw myself. I was no longer the broken veteran struggling to find her place in civilian society. I was no longer defined by my family's initial disappointment or their eventual pride. I was simply Sarah Mitchell, a person who had served her country, faced challenges, and found a way to turn personal struggle into meaningful change. The nightmares still came occasionally, but they were manageable now. The hypervigilance that had made civilian employment so difficult had been redirected into an intense focus on helping other veterans. The experiences that had once felt like disabilities had become sources of strength and understanding. As evening approached, I reviewed the day's schedule for the Veterans Center. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new veterans seeking help, new opportunities to make a difference. The work would continue long after I was gone, sustained by the growing community of people who believed that every veteran's service mattered. I thought about the woman I'd been just over a year ago unemployed, struggling, dismissed by her own family as a failure. That woman could never have imagined sitting in this office, reading letters from the president, planning the expansion of a national network of support centers. The journey from shame to honor, from isolation to purpose, from family disappointment to national recognition, had taught me that transformation is always possible. It had shown me that the most important battles are often fought not with weapons, but with persistence, dignity, and an unwavering commitment to serving something larger than yourself. The Medal of Honor had given me recognition, but the work itself had given me peace, and in the end, peace was the only victory that really mattered.